Dwarves are in many fantasy settings portrayed as not being very magical in nature. They are in many respects depicted as a contrast to the magically gifted but somewhat frail and slender-bodied elves, and therefore set up as burly, stalwart, and unshakable laborers, soldiers, craftsmen, and artisans that are more connected to the physical instead of the metaphysical aspects of their respective worlds. And part of this seems to be a certain inertness or resistance to magic. So today I'm going over some of the different reasons why this could hold indeed true, and the simplest and easiest is because dwarves have tougher biological bodies, while a human or an elf therefore could perish if half of their respective bodies are burned. Thanks to the good old fireball spell, the dwarf might suffer a great deal and be almost certainly rendered combat ineffective. But given enough medical attention and treatment, he could survive the ordeal, and potentially even regenerate the lost bits of his skin over the course of, let's say, a year or so, simply because it has been well established that dwarven biology is far more resilient than that of the average human. So therefore, from our own perspective, it would seem like that dwarves have more resistance to magic than the average human, simply because they can survive injuries fatal to us. So from a point of view character, from a human point of view character to be precise, it would seem that dwarves are just more resistant to magic. So yes, indeed, from our own human point of view, and from various human characters in various fantasy books, it would really seem like dwarves are more resistant to magic, but not because they are resistant to magic, but because they are dwarves, and dwarves are very resilient in general. Another and far more generally applied reason is that dwarves are grounded in the physical world, and this in and of itself gives them a certain resistance to the metaphysical aspects of the world. For example, since dwarves deal so much with physical labor, and since their magic, if they have any, is more focused on runes and runecraft and inscriptions than offensive spellcasting, the dwarves basically shield themselves from the more magical aspects of their respective worlds thanks to their collective minds, which form a barrier to the metaphysical aspects of the magical world, and thus any magic used against them is greatly weakened, diminished, or downright negated. This principle is best seen in Warhammer Fantasy, where belief shapes the world in various ways, and since dwarves believe wholeheartedly that yes, indeed, they are completely inert to magic, immune to its influence, and can in turn not utilize or cast it, their collective psychic will, their blind faith in being very non-magical in nature, makes it so that dwarves can outright ignore spells that would be downright deadly to a human man, or an orc, or a goblin. Since dwarves all believe that they are nearly immune to magic, it indeed takes a far greater magic potency to actually harm a dwarf with magic. And funnily enough, these so-called chaos dwarves are able to cast magic which normal dwarves can't do, while they in turn are now as vulnerable towards magic as the average orc or goblin or man, though they still benefit from their dwarven physique and resilience, giving them a better chance to survive the damage caused by a spell. Another way for dwarves to be very resilient to any and all magic is simply because they might employ powerful counter magic. This could, among other things, take the form of runes. And since dwarves already built their holds on top of a mountain full of gold, valuable ores, and gemstones, their very mentality would be more focused around defending this valuable spot of land and the treasures within it, instead of going on the offensive and conquering vast stretches of land. And this mentality might be very much reflected in their arms and armor. So not only would dwarves practice magic more in line with their way of life as craftsmen and artisans, but rather than learning to cast magic as an individual, they would choose to inscribe magic in the form of runes onto various weapons, armor, war gear, and just everyday items and appliances, making them very durable and something that could actually outlast the individual dwarf after he died. These runes would undoubtedly be focused on enhancing the armor's defense, especially against magic, wards against fire, heat, smoke, or toxic fumes might become a common standard for many dwarven runesmiths, and indeed they might be a prerequisite to even be allowed to call oneself a smith at all. And while the dwarven mountain holds, as well as their entrenchments, tunnels, and underground fortresses and steep slopes are very effective against fending off physical attacks, such as invading armies and their projectile weapons and their siege artillery, the more metaphysical aspects of their world, such as for example a fire demon that constantly consumes precious oxygen in the air, are likely a far greater threat to the dwarves, especially when encountered underground. So wards against magical creatures and magic in general might be inscribed every few hundred meters on every tunnel entrance, and many dwarves will know counter spells against demons, evil spirits, and magical spells in general, or rather have runes that counter them inscribed on their everyday attire, and maybe perhaps even their very bodies. And it would be common sense for any dwarf, especially if they leave the safety of their hold and go in the valley below, to actually equip quite a bit of defense against magic. And these dwarven runes and anti-magical wards could not only feed on the dwarf's own mana reserves, but they could indeed use the incoming magic in order to neutralize at least a part of it. So just like the Tesla valve, that could be used to greatly increase the resistance of flowing water by turning it against itself, by redirecting the water so that current meets current, which then would cause a great deal of resistance. Magical wards could channel incoming magic in such a way that they would redirect parts of it against itself. So just like reactive armor in today's day and age is used to protect a tank from armor-breaching ammunition by countering incoming explosive energies and the plasma jet these ammunitions, mines and shells project, redirecting it away from the tank, the dwarven runes and wards might channel magic in such a way that the spell works at least partially against itself. Combined with the dwarven runes of resistance and defiance, and of course the actual armor, in combination with the strong dwarven physique, the dwarves, while generally just being as susceptible to magic like the average human, could ward off magical spells that would knock out or indeed vaporize a normal human soldier, which then of course would associate dwarves with immunity or at least greater resistance to magic. And finally, the dwarf's very soul could have either been made or evolved so that they are simply more resistant to magic. So any creator deity would have given the dwarves not only a tough body, but also a resilient soul to match. As for the evolutionary path, since dwarves mine magical ores and crystals, a certain degree of resistance to magical influence would form rather quickly, since the more resilient a dwarf is, the more ores and crystals he or she can extract and work into usable forms, without being easily harmed, killed, or just rendered impotent. This would, over the course of just a couple of generations, render the dwarves fairly resistant to magic. Just like snakes in Australia evolve smaller mouths and larger bodies so that they can feed on the poisonous cane toad. By simply limiting the size of the toad they can actually swallow and therefore the amount of poison they can intake, while simultaneously growing larger, so that they would receive less toxin per kilogram of body mass, In the span of just a couple of decades, the dwarves over just a few generations would have become rather resilient, if not downright resistant, to magical energies that would warp, twist, corrupt, or just render a normal human man infertile. And that's pretty much how dwarves can become, or at least be seen, to be immune or resilient to magic. And now it's your turn. Do you agree with my thesis? Do you have other ways that would render a dwarf resistant to magic? Let me know down in the comment section. And while you type, I say thank you very much for watching and have a nice day.